Danielle from ABC Life Support, back again on Thursday, I think it's the 9th, to discuss with you guys burns, how to treat them, and how to prevent them from happening actually. And I do have a little guest with me here today. Come forward. This is Hermione, this is my daughter, and the reason why I brought her onto this session today is because when she was about 18 months old, she had a very bad burn in our house. So I brought her on here to have a bit of a discussion with me to discuss that, so you guys can kind of get an understanding of what it's like to be in a situation where there is a burn and how to treat it. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello, darling.
So, when I got burned, what happened?
So we were at my darling friend Colette's house in Stevenage, where we used to live, and Colette and I had made a cup of coffee, and I was going to work to do a first aid training course at Family Centre, and I left my coffee on the shelf, and actually it was one of these shelves, and you toddled over and you put your hands up and you pulled them both down onto your chest. I know, right? Yeah. So yeah, it wasn't very nice at all.
And did you know what to do when it happened?
Do you believe I did? Yes, I did. And it's funny because knowing what I know is really important, because I was able to kind of get on with it really quickly without any hesitation.
Yeah.
You know, so it's really important to be able to know what to do in the event of that burn. So I did, and I did exactly what it is I needed to do.
And how did you feel when it happened?
Oh my gosh. I think the interesting thing about this sort of burn is that as a mum, as a parent, as a carer, anybody, you don't go out with the intention of hurting your kids in that sense. And because you were so little, I didn't think you could reach it. And all of a sudden you grew and you reached up and you pulled them down, because a couple of weeks before that you couldn't reach that shelf. Yeah. So you grew in that time, and then you pulled the cup of coffee down onto your chest, and I was devastated. I mean, really, really upset, but panicked. I was panicky, but I think actually what's quite interesting is even with my level of knowledge, the panic was there because it's my child. And I was really worried about her, but I believed in the process and just got on with it.
Did you take me to the hospital or just stay at home?
No, I took you to the hospital. Actually, Colette called the ambulance, and the ambulance came, and there were 4 people in the ambulance, and the guy came in with a huge roll of cling film, which I'll talk about later on, and he said, oh, okay, she's fine. And by that time you'd been in the water for quite a long time, and you were very, very upset, and you were crying quite a lot. And he took you out of the water and checked you over, and then we went to hospital, which was quite embarrassing, I'm not going to lie, because obviously people in the street knew what I did, and to have an ambulance pull up outside my house, I was a bit like, oh. But we had to go in the ambulance just to check on your oxygen levels because of hypothermia, but again, I'll speak about that later. So yeah, that was it really. And then I never left that coffee up on the shelf again, ever again. And you've burnt yourself at home before, haven't you?
Yeah, with things like making golden syrup sauce. That hurt. And like just when cooking and stuff.
And what did you do with that burn?
Well, I was just making some sauce for popcorn, and I grabbed it out of the microwave and it just spilled all over my hand, so I just ran to the bathroom, turned on the cold tap and just sat there for ages. Even though it was like still burning, I sat there, and then yeah, it just happened. And
then it didn't burn anymore, did it? You're a very clever girl. Thank you very much. Thank you, Miney. I'll catch up with you later.
Yes.
Ciao. Bye. So in terms of those kind of 2 experiences that kind of stand out for us, the biggest take home is that you need to treat burns at home. I have been to A&E a number of times in my life, and with my children, and I've sat and watched people come into A&E with burns, right? And I'm like, because you shouldn't need to be at A&E if you treat yourself effectively when you've burnt yourself, or when somebody in your house has burnt yourself. You just have to believe in the process. So I'm going to use my trusty board to be able to demonstrate that for you. I'm just going to swap around sides just so that I can write it here, because this is what I tend to teach on a course. So there are kind of three methods in terms of checking for the size and the depth of a burn, and I'm just going to run through them with you. So the first one is what we call a superficial burn, right? So that affects the top layer of the skin, and I'll bring this in for you in a minute so you can see it in a little bit more detail. But this is a superficial burn. Everybody's had one. If you've been taking food out of the oven, you've burnt yourself with an iron, they're superficial burns. They affect the top layer of the skin, and they're painful, but nobody normally treats themselves effectively with them because, well, especially if you're like me, I'm normally cooking dinner at the time and my food comes first, I'm not going to lie. So, we'll live with that and get on with it and have a little bit of a mark, and it will cause us a bit of pain, but people tend not to treat themselves effectively for those. The problem you've got with this sort of burn is that if you do not treat it effectively, then the second layer of defence then pops in, and that's what we classify as a blister. Alright, so inside of this blister, this is what we call a partial thickness burn, and inside of this blister is something called plasma. It's a serum that comes up from the blood supply, and is there to help cool the skin and clean it. But you shouldn't get a blister, because if we've dealt with this one, then we shouldn't have that. And again, I'll come back to that later. Now, away from these two, which as far as I'm concerned, you can do an awful lot at home for, to the point where you might not necessarily need to go to hospital. This one, which is what we call a full thickness burn, causes so much skin damage that the cold water will be used for pain relief, but this person is going to need hospital intervention immediately, and they may have skin grafts, they may have extensive skin damage, problem with infection, so we've got a real problem with this one. So this one always needs to be seen by a medical professional, and these sorts of burns happen because, for example, if somebody's been in a fire and they've got burns down the back of their hand, they might have mixed depths of burns as well. So it's dry, not a lot of serum, and it's extremely painful. Whereas these ones, again, this one being extremely painful, and this one being extremely painful, these ones I can cope with at home. I can do an awful lot more at home. I've just got to trust in the process. So in order for you to know what that process is, I'm just going to bring this in a little bit more just so you can see. What I need people to understand is that this bit here, this is where the superficial burn hits. The treatment needs to be done immediately. And the treatment is cold water. So with Hermione's burn, when she was little, I took her to the shower, to the bath actually. I stood her up in the bath and I got the shower head and I poured the cold water down her chest. And I stayed there for about 25 minutes. Now, most people will put their burn underneath a tap for a couple of minutes and then wonder why it's still painful after a couple of minutes. But again, don't bother with any further treatment because they can kind of get on with it. It's not that painful for them. But when it's our loved ones, when it's somebody who's little and they can't make that decision for themselves, then trust in the process. It is cold running water over the burn. Now, what the cold running water does is it takes the heat down the drain. Okay? That's all it does. The cold water picks up the heat and takes it down the drain. And you need to continue doing this for a minimum 20 minutes. Alright, 20 minutes is a long time. A minute is a long time. And people go, oh yeah, but it's really painful if you do that with cold water. Yeah, it is. But the burn is also really painful. And again, when it comes to our loved ones, we've got to make that decision for them, right? Whenever I'm delivering a training course for adults, especially if it's paediatric, I always say to them, no, with the greatest of respect, if you can't be bothered to treat yourself for 20 minutes because it's taking too much time or it's not that painful, that's fine. That's your decision. You're a grown up. But at the same time, when we're dealing with our kids, you've got to make the right decision for them because they're the ones that are going to end up with the pain and with the problems, especially if this then happens. Because if these blisters are really extensive and we get to hospital, then these need to have to be treated. And trust me, that's also a painful process. So although Hermione had to go to hospital, the reason she had to go to hospital was to check on her oxygen levels in her blood because I treated her with cold water for 25 minutes down her chest, and that's her core area. So it's really important for them to be able to check that she hasn't suffered from hypothermia. But because I know that, when I treated her, I put a towel over her head and her back and just kept as much body heat in her body as I could whilst I had the shower down the front of her chest. Okay, so cold running water picks up the heat, takes it down the drain. 20 minutes is a minimum. So if you take that limb or whatever it is out of the cold water after 20 minutes and it's still red and it is still painful and that person's still crying, put it back. All right. When we're dealing with little ones, it is important that you get them seen by a medical professional, especially if it covers more than 1% of their body. Now that is 1%, all right? We measure 1% by 1 palm's worth. And if you place that over the body, okay, then it's relative to them and relative to us. So it's important that you understand that that person should be seen by a medical professional if they're little, if it's across their face, all the way around a limb, on their hands and feet, okay, so the bottoms of their feet as well, really important, which happens with bath burns. So when we're talking to new parents, we always tell the parents to try and get into the habit of running your bath for the baby with cold water first, especially if they're toddling, because if they can toddle, they can get into the bath, and the problem is with little ones in the bath, they can't get out. So if the water's warm, then, you know, we've got a risk obviously, but we haven't got a risk of burning, whereas old-fashioned taps used to be that you fill up the hot water first and then fill up with cold. So if you can kind of swap those bits around, that does mitigate the risk of burns in a bath, which are catastrophic. Okay, so we have our superficial burn, which if not dealt with effectively could then lead to a partial thickness burn. Treatment: cold running water for a minimum of 20 minutes, and if it's still burning, then you put them back until that marker's gone. With Hermione, there was no mark to report of. There was no redness, there was no scarring, there was no nothing. The only reason we had to go to hospital, like I mentioned earlier, was to check for hypothermia, of which there wasn't. So I'm not talking to you about this from a book. I'm not talking to you about this from the position of, you know, oh, well, this is what first aid says. No, I've done it, been there, done it, got the t-shirt, and I promise you that it does work. With the full thickness burn, there is not much that we can do that's going to potentially save this person from extensive skin damage, but we can use our cold water and our knowledge to try and keep that person with the cold water as some kind of pain relief offering until we get treatment in a hospital. Okay, so they're the 3 forms of burns. When we talk about burns, scalding, which is what happened with Hermione, is a wet burn. So steam, liquids, water is a wet burn. A scald is what we call it, and then everything else is what we would classify as a dry burn. Chemicals as well can cause burns, as we know, and the treatment actually comes in line with this. It was 20 minutes for chemical burns previously and 10 minutes for any other burn. Now it's all the same, but as an absolute minimum. Now, the Child Accident Prevention Trust, I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, talk about burns extensively in their learning and in their information. I would strongly recommend that you go onto that website whilst you have time and just have a look at the things, especially if you're a new parent, have a look at the things in terms of what your children are likely to do in terms of their development and how easy it is for them to pick up things like cups of coffee and pulling things from stoves, so making sure that the stove handles are wrapped around the side and not leaning over the front. Especially if they're in a baby walk or anything like that, they've got extended height, which they don't normally have. And don't trust your kids. That sounds awful, but when they're little, they are interested in absolutely everything and anything. Even if it's the most boring and mundane thing to us, they are interested in that and they will try and go for it. So please, please, please make sure that you are getting into the habit of putting your coffee a bit higher up on the shelf or away from the baby, so that they don't have an interest in what it is that you've got. Because the problem with accidents is, by definition, they are preventable. If we understood the levels of development for our children, then maybe we can head these off before they happen, and and head off the need to go into hospital, especially because we are panicked. So my advice for any person who suffers from a burn: trust in the process. I have had so many people when I've delivered training courses say, oh my gosh, I did that and I used the cold water, and they'll Facebook message me and say, I did it and I haven't got any mark anymore, and I'm like, yay. Could you send me a photo? Just so I can prove to people that it does work. It's not just, making it up. 20 minutes of cold running water as a minimum does stop that burn from getting any worse. So when it comes to our children, we've got to take control and know that what we're doing is going to make a difference to them. So it's a short and sharp one today because it is very simple to treat, okay? 20 minutes cold running water, absolute minimum. The only difference is, actually, I'll mention it, if it's in the face, so if the person's burnt their face, you cannot put their face underneath a cold tap, okay? But what you can do is get flannels of cold running water and just place it over, the face and squeeze the water out, or you can get a low pressure shower lid tap and put it over their face and just allow that cold water to keep dripping, and be aware of problems with swelling. Alright, so especially in the mouth, if it's anywhere near the mouth, so just be aware of that airway problem which we looked at in the very beginning of our sessions. So there you go, that's burns today on Thursday. Next week I think we're looking at choking or anaphylaxis, I'm not sure, but I will let you know and we'll give you the heads up as to what we're doing next week. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time. Please feel free to share this video, and if you've got any questions, please pop them in the comments and I will do my best to answer them after this video. But otherwise, take care, have a great day. Bye.